So our theme this year for Easter is light in the darkness. Now, darkness is one of those things that is pretty universally despised. I mean, there's a time and place for it, but as kids, one of the first things you're afraid of is being in the dark. For all the kids in here, raise your hand if you're scared of the dark, and it's okay. I see some adults too, right? Right? As a kid, it's terrifying. My son, when he goes into his room, if the lights are off, he has to stop at the door and go, "I am brave," and then goes in. Because he's scared. He doesn't know what's going on in there. Even as adults, we still sometimes get this, right? It's amazing how the same stretch of a street can feel great during the day and then just feel so unsettling at night, just because you can't see what's happening. A handful of years ago, I got to go to South Africa on a agricultural trip, and while we were there, we got to go to a kind of a reservation for animals, a preserve, and we got to see all sorts of things. So we were riding in this little buggy. It was open top. The fresh air was beautiful. I remember driving down this one path, and it was lined with these gorgeous trees. And I just remember thinking wow, this is gorgeous. This is just fascinating. And I'm looking around, and we got to see all sorts of cool animals. We got to see the giraffes and the elephants and all of that. Well, we'd gone out in the afternoon and got to see all these things, and then we turned around eventually, and the sun started to set, and everything got a little bit darker. And I remember thinking, all right, this is still cool. It's gorgeous. We got to see the sunset. Now it's kind of the afterglow. It's getting a little dark, but, we're on our way back. And our tour guide, who had been showing us all these things, eventually got so dark, he got a flashlight out, and he started shining it in those same trees that I had seen earlier that I thought, those are really cool. And so we eventually asked him, hey, Mr. Tour Guide, why are you shining that flashlight up in the trees? Are you going to show us some monkeys or something? And he said, no. At nighttime, leopards prowl in there, and if they see prey moving underneath, they jump on it. And so he was looking for leopards that could potentially pounce upon us. And so all of a sudden, these trees that were oh, these are amazing, are holy cow, stay away from the trees. They were terrifying. And there's something about darkness that conceals and it hides, and there's fear that's baked in because there's uncertainty and you can't see what is there. And so darkness, for a lot of people, continues to be this thing that burdens us. It's an experience that people often relate to, and it's no surprise because all of the universal history can be explained in one sense as a battle between two opponents, light and dark. Two different forces that are opposed to one another, that are constantly battling with each other. So for instance, if you look at the Bible, you go all the way to the very beginning, the creation of everything, the whole universe. God speaks the world into existence. Do you know what the first thing he does is? So it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything was formless, and the Spirit hovered over the water. And then right away in verse 3, this is the first thing that we have God's action doing something. In Genesis 1, verse 3, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. The very beginning, God creates everything, and he creates this light, and it's good, and he separates it from the darkness. And from then on would become a cosmic battle between two forces for all of human history. Light, good, hope, joy, peace. Darkness, pain, despair. And these two forces, they go back and forth throughout all of human history. And every person who is ever born is born into this battle. There's no way to escape it. You are thrust into a life where these two forces are going at it and you are caught in the middle. Where you're experiencing the joys of life and you're experiencing the darknesses. And if you look out throughout the biblical history, you see this as an ongoing battle. You have God and his powers of light, his forces. He creates a people to be a blessing to the earth. And then you have a nation that enslaves them. And God's punishment is he puts those people, the Egyptians who are enslaving them, in total darkness. Right? God eventually leads his people out there. They become a light to the world, but eventually they slip back into the darkness. And so there's this constant tug of war that is going on throughout all of history. And as people, this is something that, like I said, we are thrust into. Because each one of us, I'm sure, if you were to recount some of the greatest moments of your life, you can think of some of the most joy-filled moments, right? Whether you're on a sports team, right, and you had just an amazing game, and there's just this euphoria of oh my gosh, I can't believe we won. You can remember all the way back as a kid in elementary school, you do track and field day, and you won that race. And on a bigger scale, you go forward, and that moment of walking across, if you graduated college, And that feeling of like, oh my gosh, all of those late nights where I slept like 3 hours a night and people said, are you okay? They were worth it because they got me to this point. Maybe you got married, maybe you got that job. There are these moments that are just filled with absolute joy. But at the same time, each of us is subjected to these moments that are filled with so much darkness. I don't know anyone who has not gone through strife, who has not gone through relational issues, who has not felt unloved by family, who has not felt broken, who has not felt thrust into despair and confusion at a diagnosis, at news of what has happened, on a personal scale, on a large scale as a nation. And so this battle continues to rage on in our lives, and being caught in the crosshairs is so difficult because at the same time we can acknowledge there is so much good in this world and yet there is so much broken. And throughout this week, we've been building up to Easter, we've been reflecting on this light because God is a God of light, He's a God who loves, He's a God of hope. And so when things were darkest in the world, when even His own people had gone astray, He had sent His Son Jesus as the light of the world. Jesus said so in John 8, He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me shall not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And from there, it seemed like everything was going to be good because, all right, Jesus has come, the light is here, this is great. And He's proclaiming good news, and people who have spent their entire life in darkness now have hope, they now have a purpose, they now have a future. And it looked like maybe for once that God sending His own Son Jesus, that the battle would be over. And then the story took a terrible plot twist. Because 2 days ago, we remembered on Good Friday that light was put out for a while. We see in John here, this is how John is assessing it. In John chapter 3, he's trying to explain how this could be, how this light of the world could be rejected. He says this, and this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people love the darkness rather than the light, because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his works should be exposed. So the gospel writer of John says, the light came into the world, and what did the people do? They rejected it because they liked the darkness more than the light. And right, intuitively, that doesn't seem to make sense because we're like, right, light, hope, promise, good, darkness, bad, despair. But here's the thing about light, is there's no place to hide in it. And if you don't believe me that people will choose darkness over light, why do you think they invented private browsing on the internet? Because we don't want our actions exposed. Because we would rather hide in the darkness than have to confront with the reality that we too often take part in that same darkness. Too often we are tugged to that side of the battle. And so as humans and as people, the people of Jesus' day, they saw this light and He exposed. The light naturally, just by its sheer presence, exposes the darkness in the world, exposes the evil. And so the people loved the darkness and rejected the light. And so they killed Him. They killed Jesus on a cross. And we're told in the other three Gospels that when Jesus was killed on the cross, that darkness overtook the whole land as the light of the world was snuffed out. And in this cosmic battle back and forth, light and dark going throughout human history, throughout all of eternity in this creation, it seemed like darkness had won. Because God had sent the best shot, the Son of God, the very light of the world Himself, into it, and darkness killed Him. And so for a while it looked like darkness would win. That was the end of the story. That's how the credits roll. Like one of those, all the critically acclaimed movies, right? Always end sad, usually. Felt like one of those. And then something changed on Easter in that reading that we had today. So I want to look at that a little bit closer with you as we look at John chapter 20. So here we have John chapter 20, verse 1. Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. I want to talk about Mary for a second because I said that every human that is ever born is born into this battle. And Mary is no different. Mary is a very prominent figure in the Bible. We don't always know a ton about her, especially her backstory, but we do know a couple things. So for instance, in Luke chapter 8, we're told this. Luke is recounting those who are following Jesus, and he says the 12 were with Jesus, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. So when Jesus found this woman, she had 7 demons living in her. I don't know the mathematical projection of 1 demon, verse 2, verse 3, but I imagine that 7 demons is pretty bad. That her life was one filled with darkness and tormented. Well, again, we don't know a ton about her story, but pretty shortly after the Bible was written, there became a tradition that believed that Mary, because of her life circumstances, was forced into a life of prostitution, which at this time meant that nobody who had any respect for themselves would come in contact with her. They wouldn't talk to her. They wouldn't look at her. Her life was one of darkness. She probably had very little social circle. Everyone would have left her. She's plagued by demons. Who knows what that does to somebody? That's not necessarily somebody you're looking to hang out with. She has no idea when this is going to change. She has no idea if there's ever going to be anything different from the life she's known. And then all of a sudden, this guy named Jesus comes along. And where everyone else would just look past her, would avoid her, like the plague, this Jesus actually talks to her, invites her to follow him. This Jesus teaches her about the love of God and the hope that he has promised. And all of a sudden, for the first time in Mary's life, she has light. She has Jesus in her life. And you think about this woman whose life has been transformed, just completely 180 from the darkest of despair to the brightest of lights, following this Jesus. And everything he says is like it comes from God himself. And everything he does is just radiating with love and goodness. And she follows him, and she celebrates him, and she praises him. And then all of a sudden, on Good Friday, she watches him die. And we're told that she was one of the few followers who stayed there by his side right up to the cross, and she watched him as he breathed his last breath. And the one person, the one hope in her entire life that she had ever had, died. She was devastated. Because this was the one who was supposed to change everything. This was the one who had made all these promises and talked about all of the goodness of God, and he's gone. And all of a sudden, as the clouds covered the sun, so did they cover the light in her heart. Once again, snuffed out. And we see this even from John's account here. I want to look back at that verse 1 again. Notice when she comes to the tomb, it's still dark. She shows up so early that it's still blackout, a symbol of the kind of state she's in. Now, she still comes because this man meant so much to her. This prophet, this son of God, as he claimed, meant so much that she wanted to properly treat his burial. Even though the hope that he had seemed to be lost, she still wanted to properly treat him with ointments and spices and give him a proper burial since they had just thrown him in there. So she stood in darkness. But she sees here that just to pile on everything, the stone had been taken away from the tomb, and the body's gone. Just talk about being kicked while you're down. She is devastated. Now she can't even honor this guy's body. She can't even treat him with proper respect, right? Somebody probably stole him, probably threw him somewhere, who knows? So she goes and she tells the disciples and Peter and John, they come running and they look and they go back. They're not exactly sure what's going on. But Mary sticks around. We're told this. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. And she saw 2 angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. Now that language of angels in white, it's kind of cool. In the Greek, it actually carries a double meaning. It's a little bit, it can be taken as the color white, but it also signifies something that is radiating. So Mary here, she is sobbing, she is weeping at all of that has come upon her, all that has come upon Jesus, and she peeks into the tomb and she sees a glimmer, this shining light. And they say to her, the angels do, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Goes on, having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. So she turns around and Jesus is there, but she doesn't get that it's him, right? Whether it's because of her sorrow, whether because he's concealed something, we're not sure, but she still doesn't know. She has that glimmer, but she doesn't see the full light. And Jesus speaks to her and says, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." So she doesn't get that it's Jesus, thinks he's a gardener. I don't know what he was wearing that would have given that away. I don't think they had overalls back then. But she sees this man, and she just assumes he's a gardener. She's again weeping, and she just says, "Did you take the body? Like, where is he? Just tell me. I'll do the rest. You don't have to do anything. Just tell me so I can properly treat him." And then what does Jesus say? Mary. He just says her name. God, through his prophet Isaiah at one point, is speaking to his people, and he says, "I have called you by name. You are mine." And Jesus says, "The sheep know the voice of their shepherd." And so in this moment, Jesus doesn't try and explain everything. He doesn't tell her why this must happen. He just speaks her name. That name that people probably refuse to speak throughout her entire life, right? She's an outcast. She's demon-possessed. But this one who would treat her like a real human being, treat her as one who needed to be loved, just comes to her in this moment and says, "Mary." And her eyes are opened. And you can just imagine when all of a sudden the darkness fades away and the light just blinds her. And she turns to him, seeing who she is, and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. She gets it. And all of a sudden that Easter morning, we're not told exactly when the sunrise is, but I have to think it's at this moment. The sun comes up, and for the first time she sees, and she gets it. This hope, this life, this light of the world has risen. The story was not over. That seemingly death blow that darkness had dealt had been overcome in victory by the light. And all of a sudden, Mary's eyes are open, and she is given hope, and she is given life once again. Jesus then says to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," that he had said these things to her. So she goes and she listens. Jesus says, I know you're excited. There's things to do. You need to go tell my disciples. You need to go tell my followers what has happened, because they think the story's over. They think that darkness has won, but it has not. Don't let them live in darkness any longer. Go tell them. And Mary goes and she does just that. She tells the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." The light, it's not gone. It's here. That he had said these things to her, right? And so you have this beautiful Easter morning that everything changed, because this battle, like I said, had been going on from the creation of time, right? Light and darkness, battling, fighting, and all of a sudden, light shows itself to be victorious. That when human history seemed the darkest, the sun rose as the sun rose. And so Mary's life is changed, and so is everyone who looks to Jesus. Because this light is for all of those who are in the darkest of darkness. All of those who are walking without knowing that this light has become victorious. I have a pastor friend, and his family went through one of the darkest moments that any family can go through. When he was, actually before he was even born, he had an older brother. We'll say his name is Brian. Brian was just an elementary kid when he was playing outside, and a garbage truck driver had been drinking the night before, was hungover, and backed up and ran over Brian. And so this family lost their little boy. And at this point, his family, they didn't believe, they didn't know Jesus, and they had no idea what to do. Their life had been fine. It seemed like it was going great. And then all of a sudden this happens, and they lose a child. And they don't know how to grapple with it. They're mourning, but they don't know how to mourn, and they're just sitting in darkness. And at that point, that could have been the end of the story. But there was a pastor in town who saw the obituary in the newspaper. He looked at the address that was listed on the obituary and said, I think I know where that is. He walked to the address, he knocked on the door, and he said, excuse me, I saw this in the newspaper that your son had passed. I was wondering if I could just come in for a couple minutes and just share a couple words of hope and encouragement. They didn't really know, again, they weren't believers, but they took him in, they let him give his talk, and he just shared about the hope of Jesus, the hope of the resurrection, of the promises, the life that he offers, the light that he is. This pastor didn't fix the problem right away. He just said, we would love to, as a church, love on you. We'd love to welcome you and just go through this with you. My pastor friend, his family started going to that church. They slowly heard more about the good news of Jesus, what he had done, what he had overcome for them. And eventually they came to believe in Jesus. They were baptized. They became part of the church. They became believers, very active. And again, my friend is a pastor now because of this. One of the things, though, that in the aftermath they struggled with is they were so grateful to have this light in their life. Again, it didn't fix the problem, but it was light in the midst of darkness. The problem was they always worried about Brian. Because they're so thankful to have this gift, but what about Brian who had gone before? Well, eventually they were far enough in the mourning process that they built up the courage and the strength to clean out his room. And if anyone has lost a family member, they know that something like that is extremely difficult, it's extremely painful, but they had gotten to a point where they felt comfortable going through his room, going through things, tidying it up. When they got to his room, they were looking through boxes and packing things and folding clothes, and they hadn't touched it since he had died, and they were looking under the bed and cleaning out stuff, and all of a sudden they pulled out a Bible. They realized it was the parents' wedding Bible. Somebody had given it to them when they were married, and they never read it. Again, they weren't Christian. But how did it get under Brian's bed? And they started flipping through it, and they found Brian had written notes in it. He had highlighted things, he had underlined things. And they opened to the famous passage in John chapter 3, verse 16, "For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life." And Brian had taken this Bible, he had circled that verse and said, "This promise is for me." That is light in darkness. And for each one of us, we are going to go through seasons of light, we're going to go through seasons of darkness, and sometimes those dark seasons can feel so long. And they don't just snap away, they don't just blow past, be positive, it's all fine. There are going to be seasons where we're going to deal with mental health struggles where it just feels like every day is a battle that nobody else gets. There are days when we are mourning loss or illness that it just feels like, man, I expected it to be easier by now. And it's in those moments that Jesus comes to us and he calls us by name. And he says to us, "You are mine." And that light shines in us. What's beautiful is in the book of John, Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." But elsewhere, then he looks to his people and he now says, "You are the light of the world." A city on a hill can't be hidden. It's going to shine forth. Just the other day, we were out here playing in the grass field. We live here on 31st, and it was nighttime. And during night, we have lights that shine back onto the stained glass on the backside. And there was somebody who was walking by, and he was in the middle of the road. I wouldn't advise that. And he saw the stained glass, and he stopped to take a picture. In the dark night, he saw the risen Jesus shining forth. And so as Christians, we have the bold honor of doing what Mary did, right? Because she experienced this light. In the darkest moment of her life, light shined in. And what did she do? She went to tell others. This light was for them. This light is meant to be shared. You think about it in our world, there's so many times where things are like a zero-sum game, right? So somebody's got to pay for it. That's always the big one, right? They can't have two winners, right? If one person wins, one person has to lose. I'm a Minnesota Gopher hockey fan. We lost the national championship last night. There can only be one winner, right? Somebody's got to lose that game. But the beautiful thing about light is it is not a zero-sum game. If you take a candle and you light another candle, that first candle loses nothing. Light only spreads. And so as God's people, we embody this, we live this out, we proclaim this news because this is not just for our darkness. This light is for the darkness of the world. We are called to go out and to shine forth in the darkest places. And in this life, darkness is going to continue to fight. Its last scraps, its last punches, it's going to claw and it's going to grab at us. Being a Christian does not mean that our life is easy. It does not mean that our life is carefree. But here's the good news, is we know how the battle is going to end. Because the same John who wrote this account of the light of Jesus rising from the dead, coming to Mary, he writes this in the book of Revelation, right? So we started in Genesis, where light and darkness were separated. In Revelation, John gets a final vision of the end of the world when Jesus returns. And he talks about what God is going to do. And he talks about this new city that we're going to live in. This world is going to be made new, and we're all going to live in this perfect, resurrected, redeemed world as God's people. And John writes this. He says, "And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it, and its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there." So in the midst, right, we've seen Jesus rise. Darkness is going to claw and scratch, but when the end comes, when Jesus returns, there's no more night. There's no more dark. All there is the light of God. And so, brothers and sisters, when we think about the darkness in this world, when we think about the darkness that takes hold of us, the darkness we confront, I want you to remember this promise. In the end, light wins. This battle goes on, but when it's over, we know the victor, the light of Jesus. And when we live in that new, perfect world, redeemed by Jesus, there's no darkness. There's no fear. There's no illness. There's no strife. There's no relational problems. There's no brokenness. All there is glorious light and love. And so as his people, this is the light we walk in. We follow this Jesus. We do what he asks us to do because he is the light. He is the life of the world. And so whatever you go through, remember this Easter, remember every day, light wins. It triumphed once. It continues to triumph. And in the last day, it'll win once and for all. May we look forward to that glorious day. In Jesus' name, amen.